It's interesting when you talk to people, they immediately think, how am I going to run my car? That seems to be sort of number one, and a lot of people, if at all, don't get past that. It goes a lot deeper than that when you start looking at how many oil products we use, and you might notice in the Cuba video that's going to be shown, the biggest problem they had when oil got cut off, when Russia basically fell and their supplier fell and they went through peak oil, was nothing to do with cars. It's like, what am I going to eat?
The breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s created a major economic crisis in Cuba known as the Special Period.
So we have, from 1989 to 1992-93, a free fall of the economy of 34% of GDP, gross domestic product. When I tell you free fall of the economy, trying to imagine an airplane suddenly lose their engines. It was really a crash.
Cuba lost 80% of its export and import markets. Oil imports dropped by more than half. Buses stopped running, factories closed, electricity blackouts were common, and food was scarce. People almost starved.
To start cultivating vegetables wherever they could.
Over the next decade, Cuba took drastic steps to find solutions. It is the first country to face the crisis that we will all face, the peak oil crisis.
There will always be oil in the ground. That's good news. Always be oil in the ground, forever. Why? Because an oil field is deemed dry when it takes more oil to get a barrel of oil out of the ground than you get from burning it.
2 years ago, we'll find that oil production is sort of reaching a peak sometime in the next few years and will be going down, and that implies basically a major change in our way of life. And what we've discovered is that Cuba, because their own artificial peak oil was imposed on them when the Soviet Union collapsed, is actually a model for what's going to take place in the rest of the world. So we wanted to see if we can capture what is it in the Cuban people and the Cuban culture that allowed to go through this very difficult time without competing over scarce resources. And we think Cuba has a lot to show the world about how to deal with energy adversity, which I think we'll all be facing.
In 1949, oil geologist Dr. M. King Hubbert developed the theory of oil depletion, making the prediction that the fossil fuel era would be very short. In 1956, he forecasted that American oil production in the continental 48 states would reach peak production in 1970. Production did peak that year, as he predicted. In 1974, Hubbert testified to a Senate subcommittee warning of the dangers of declining fossil fuels in an exponential growth culture. The U.S. oil peak in 1970, combined with a crisis in the Middle East, led to severe oil shortages and an economic crisis in the country. Americans experienced record high interest rates, long gas lines, the highest gasoline prices in history, recession, and a declining stock market. In 1997, petroleum geologist Dr. Colin Campbell wrote The Coming Oil Crisis. 3 years later, he founded the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, known as ASPO, and held the first meeting on peak oil in Sweden in 2002. Dr. Ken DeFay, a Princeton oil geologist, published Hubbert's Peak in 2001, followed 2 years later by Richard Heinberg's seminal work, The Party's Over. In 2005, Matt Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert, challenged the stated oil reserves of Saudi Arabia.
If it turns out that Saudi Arabia has peaked, then categorically the world has peaked.
The debate over the peaking of oil on the planet has begun. And for the scientists involved, it is not so much a question of if or how, but when.
It's a pleasure for me to open this ASPO seminar. We need to recognize that the issue of the peak oil production is an open-ended debate.
My feeling is that we are going to run into serious trouble by 2010, more or less.
The peak has happened, and now instead of being prophets, we're now historians.
When it comes to estimates by the well-informed folks, it almost feels like you're throwing darts. There are so many, and yet they're grouping fairly. They're starting to group tighter. Most of them end up projecting a peak by or before 2020.
I detect it on many sides now that there is a growing awareness. We've moved beyond asking if there is a peak to ask how big it is, how soon it is, and more than that, what we might do about it. It's no longer sort of the words of some crank in the wilderness. It's becoming, and it has to become, very topical.
It's going to come to suburbia probably much sooner rather than later. I happen to agree with many of the people we heard here that peak oil is here now.
Now that we know there's no unused surplus oil in the Middle East, sorry, that's it. And so we probably have passed the Hubbard peak.
I think it's between 2005 and 2007. That's what my model shows.
I'm sorry to say, really, that the suburban family in America is really going down the wrong path. So what is the impact on the ordinary citizen around? Well, for a few years he can buy another large car. He can smile that there's not a cloud on the horizon. And then the crisis, when it hits, is that much worse.
The end of cheap oil and gas is coming, but we have all come to take for granted their benefits. Our affluence in North America, our new cars, our suburban lifestyles, all this is dependent on an abundance of cheap oil and gas. What will be the consequences as fossil fuels become more scarce and more expensive?
It's so easy to go into denial about peak oil because it changes everything. Every one of us has grown up during this unique historical period when we've had easy access to cheap energy and all of the things that cheap energy can do for us. And so even people who intellectually understand peak oil, as soon as they turn their attention away, almost immediately start to go into sort of their normal mode of thinking. It's a natural human response. I find myself doing it all the time, and I spend hours every day studying peak oil from all sorts of different standpoints. As soon as I turn my attention away, suddenly I'm in the normal world again, the so-called normal world, the consensus trance that we all live in on a daily basis.
We are almost absolutely, totally dependent on oil for all of our activities. First of all, industry, of course, runs on oil. Everyone understands that. Agriculture, modern mechanized agriculture to feed the world, is heavily dependent on oil. If you look at transportation, again, it's obvious, cars and planes run on oil, petroleum, gasoline. And of course, military capability. You cannot fight a war, as the Americans know, without oil. So every aspect of human existence is dependent on oil. And when we reach that point, when we get to maximum production, maximum supply capacity relative to demand, that is a very significant point, which many people think, including me, is without precedent in human history. Not that they don't know. I mean, governments are extremely well briefed. Their leading officials make sure that they're in contact with all the leading organizations in the country, particularly sort of business and certainly the oil industry, which is so important. They will have talked exhaustively about this.
If you're a politician in a country that matters and you say, I've got a concern about oil depletion, what's your next sentence? What do you say after that? You've essentially just said, the world as you know it is going to end.
The mainstream media, I think, have done an abysmal job. I mean, the average person knows much more about the personal habits of Brad Pitt than they know about peak oil and what's going to affect their life in the near future. I mean, if they don't have food to eat, if they don't have a job, that's something they need to know about beforehand. That's something they need to prepare for. And peak oil is the event of our lifetimes.
Money's an interesting one. We live in a capitalist society. It's pretty much taken over the world. It knocked the Berlin Wall down. It brought China into the fold. It's a system that needs to continually expand. Money, the system requires that we grow, and furthermore, what enables capitalism to stay in its place is the fact that we borrow. We have to borrow to keep it going.
The economy is really kept afloat by the confidence of investors and consumers that economic growth is going to continue. If there's a widespread perception that the economy is going to contract, people will stop taking out new loans. People will stop buying new houses. Investors will stop investing. And the consequence of that is that the economy will begin to shrink. If the economy is not continually growing, that means new loans aren't being taken out, and new loans are the means by which the money supply expands. Money is created through the making of loans. So if more money isn't being created, that means that not enough money will exist to pay back existing loans at interest. That means there will be foreclosures, and when that happens, money effectively starts to disappear from the economy.
The decline itself is not really a serious crisis, but as the financial community wakes up that the growth is no longer possible, and this decline has not only started, but it's going on, it's not just a little downturn, it's a beginning of a new age, that this could cause quite a shock. I mean, it could cause resource wars for people to try and get access to what is left. It could, I think personally, it probably heralds the second Great Depression, that somehow they've got to wipe out just mountains of capital.
My whole thesis is that until you change the way money works, you change nothing. Period. Our economic paradigm is based upon infinite growth. Or if you're looking on the graph this way, infinite growth. For the past 50 years, there's been a 96% correlation between economic growth, GDP growth, whatever you want to call it, and greenhouse gas emission. You cannot have economic growth without burning more energy. It's simple if you think about it. If Joe Blow wants to open a pizza parlor or a nail salon or whatever, you got to build. So you got to have the trucks drive in, you got to hook up the power, people got to drive their cars, you got to burn electricity. You got to burn energy to get there and use it. Economic growth not possible without energy. So now the need for infinite economic growth set by the economic paradigm is colliding with finite energy. Something's got to give. I didn't come up with this great notion. Matthew Simmons, the world's largest energy investment banker. Clients include the World Bank, Kerr-McGee, Halliburton. The world economy, the world economic paradigm is based upon fiat currency, basically the United States dollar, but most other currencies are fiat currency. Fractional reserve banking, where a bank can lend between $9 and $15, depending upon their reserve requirements, based upon how many dollars they have on deposit, and debt-based growth. You borrow money to grow. That economic paradigm requires infinite growth. Every year, the companies that trade their stock on Wall Street have to report growth or their stocks collapse and the CEOs get fired. $2 billion a day in foreign investment to keep this economy from imploding right now. The Fed and the Treasury are doing nothing to discourage consumer debt. The U.S. government, Treasury, Federal Reserve doing nothing to stop any of these trends. They're betting on China, and most equity has already moved in. And the first thing everybody says is, why would George Bush and Dick Cheney want to wreck the U.S. economy? Let me ask a rhetorical question. How many people believe that the Great Depression really hurt the Rockefellers? How many people believe that the Great Depression really took wealth away from the richest 1%, the Morgans, the DuPonts? It's exactly right, because the Great Depression was a wealth transfer. It was not a depression, it was a transfer. The economy's getting ready to collapse, big time, and that's the whole picture for the United States. The trade deficit represents debts and bonds that are like $900 billion, and the stock value is only worth $100 million. That's why the collapse is inevitable.
Planet Earth. In 4,500 million years, our world has gone through many natural changes. Now it's changing once again, but this time we ourselves are contributing to those changes. We are causing the world to heat up. If we continue to behave as we are doing, our children and grandchildren will have to deal with extreme and potentially catastrophic changes. The vast forests of the Amazon could wither and burn. The oceans could turn acid, destroying much of the life they presently contain. The Arctic could be transformed, its ice could melt, and its most famous animals vanish forever. Rising tides could cast millions of people adrift. Many of our coastal cities could be flooded and drowned. We still have time. There are ways to minimize these changes if we all choose now to adopt them. But the next few years will be crucial. If we miss our chance, the future may be grim indeed for life on planet Earth. The great majority of scientists are now agreed that our planet is warming and that human beings are at least some part of the reason it's doing so. The questions now are what is going to happen and what can we do about it?
The people who are warning of disaster are literally thousands of scientists in dozens of scientific fields, including biologists, climatologists, marine biologists, system analysts, archaeologists, hydrologists, soil scientists. These people are mostly conservative by nature. They're not given to making extravagant claims. They're amongst the best educated people in the entire world. And if these people are worried, then it behoves us to be worried too.
We know there is now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than at any time in the last 650,000 years. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Invisible and odorless, it surrounds our planet, warming it like a blanket. And every year, we add another 25 billion tons of it to the atmosphere. As the blanket gets thicker, the planet gets warmer. In cities all over the developed world, millions of ordinary households produce great quantities of carbon dioxide simply by going about their daily lives. So far, it's the Western world which has produced the majority of the greenhouse gases. But that is set to change. Meet Mr. and Mrs. Tan. They are a fictional couple living in an average Chinese suburb. And they, together with 1.3 billion Chinese, are heading for a more energy-intensive lifestyle. Mr. Tan has got a new job, and it comes with a flat in the latest upmarket development, complete with state-of-the-art, energy-hungry fittings. To fuel their economic boom, China has one main cheap source of energy: coal. Coal is the most carbon dioxide polluting source of energy we have. Currently, China is planning to build a large coal-fired power plant every week for the next 7 years. In as little as 20 years, China is likely to become the world's #1 greenhouse gas emitter. There is an explosion in energy consumption worldwide, and by 2050 we're on course to have doubled the amount we emit.
If you look at 1,000 years worth of temperature and compare it to 1,000 years of CO2, you can see how closely they fit together. Now, 1,000 years of CO2 in the mountain glaciers, that's one thing, but in Antarctica, they can go back 650,000 years. This, incidentally, is the first time anybody outside of a small group of scientists has seen this image. This is the present day era, and that's the last ice age. Then it goes up. We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. That's the period of warming between the last two ice ages. That's the second and third ice age back, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh ice age back. Now, an important point. In all of this time, 650,000 years, the CO2 level has never gone above 300 parts per million. Now, as I said, they can also measure temperature. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside. In the parts of the United States that contain the modern cities of Cleveland, Detroit, New York, in the northern tier, this is the difference between a nice day and having a mile of ice over your head. Keep that in mind when you look at this fact. Carbon dioxide, having never gone above 300 parts per million, here is where CO2 is now. Way above where it's ever been as far back as this record will measure. Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point. The crew here has tried to teach me how to use this contraption here, so if I don't kill myself, I'll... It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. You've heard of off the charts. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here. There's not a single fact or date or number that's been used to make this up that's in any controversy. The so-called skeptics look at this and they say, so? That seems perfectly okay. Well, these are actual measurements of atmospheric temperature since our Civil War. In any given year, it might look like it's going down, but the overall trend is extremely clear. And in recent years, it's uninterrupted, and it is intensifying. In fact, if you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured in this atmospheric record, they've all occurred in the last 14 years. And the hottest of all was 2005.
Most of us relish the chance to soak up a little heat. Remember the summer of 2003? But that summer had a dark side. Tens of thousands of Europeans died in the heat. We all would like to know for certain what will happen to our climate in the future, whether we'll be sweltering in a heat wave or inundated by floods. But scientists can only give us a range of possibilities, and what they're telling us is that our world will warm anywhere between 1.4 and 5.8 degrees Celsius in the next century. To put it another way, the impact of global warming will be somewhere between severe and catastrophic.
We can't hide behind our walls with our, with our basement stuffed full of baked beans. It's not going to work. And that's what Cuba experienced. You know, that whoever you were, whatever you had been in this current life, in the next one, you're all hungry, and farming together is a lot easier than farming on your own. Yeah.
It's this thing of cooperating with each other. Not only is it logical and sensible from the point of view of sharing our resources and our talents and our skills, it's absolutely necessary. There's no way around it.
Clearly food's going to be an issue.
Cuba had committed to the Green Revolution, a system which requires the massive use of fossil fuels in the form of natural gas-based fertilizers, oil-based pesticides, and diesel fuel for tractors and other farm machinery.
People, they end up squatting places in the city and growing food there without knowing how, because there were engineers, there were doctors, there was not farmers.
A drastic effort to convert every piece of arable land to organic agriculture was begun. The government imported 1.2 million bicycles from China and manufactured 500,000 more.
We had to then learn how to use bicycles, and bicycles was distributed all around the country to try to get to our workplaces. Doctors went to the hospitals, on bikes, without any culture of using bikes. It was just political will, that was it. There's no other way.
every vacant lot in the city was turned into orchard.
At first, urban gardening was an ad hoc local survival response to the crisis.
They needed food, they didn't know how, and they just did it, trial and error. And there wasn't space. They have a problem with garbage, dumping, rats, so they fix all of those problems, get rid of the garbage and start growing things there.
Now that I've watched some of these DVDs, you sort of got one foot in the camp where you've got to keep paying your mortgage and your bills and whatever, and yet you're trying to prepare for, we don't know what's coming next, who knows. First thing you might do is watch these DVDs and get a sense of whether it's real for you. In the rare moments I watch mainstream TV, it's like, maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's not happening. You know, this is pretty serious, and there's some pretty credible people talking about it. You can do a lot to make a difference, you know. There's lots of things.
We can join our energies and our skills and our talents, our resources, and start this process of mutual support. Because the whole financial model is working only for a very few people at the top of a pyramid, and the most of us it's simply not working for, and it's working less and less and less. And there are things you can do. I mean, learn to grow something. You know, decide, okay, this year you're going to grow a whole bunch of tomatoes and you're going to share it with your friends. And if you've got some friends that you know well, maybe suggest that they grow a bunch of lettuces and share them with you. And somebody else can be doing onions and someone potatoes. And, you know, you don't have to know it all, but start thinking about working together a little bit.
Let's have the Waikiki Energy Company. Let's set up a wind farm, maybe. Why not sell it back to the grid on windy days, you know? We can do all that. And we'd feel bloody good about doing it. I would. Is it doable? Would people buy shares in it? Let's have a go, you know?
Over the next year or two, when you start to see these initiatives that are coming online that do help us become more self-reliant as a community, support them. You know, get behind them. If you have decisions being made by people that don't live here, that don't understand the intricacies of the island and how it works, and also don't have the links and connections with the community and all of the other resources that exist here, then there's so many lost opportunities to be very, very creative.
The people cooperating with and caring about each other are the main factors that we need to encourage. We can all plant fruit trees, we can all have water catchment devices on our roofs. It's not the technology, it's the human relationships.
We have to find ways to meet our needs by this process of mutual support.